It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
That's what courage looks like. It's this authentic stamp of how he's living his life. And there's something really beautiful about completely relentless desires and passions that you're willing to pursue despite the public stares.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
G'day, this is Dr. Justin Coulson, the author of 6 books about making your family happier, the parenting expert on Channel 9's parental guidance. And every now and again, I don't know how to say this and not sound like I'm gushing or being silly about it, but every now and again on this podcast, I get to talk to somebody who I am so dead set stoked to talk to, and today is one of those days. Professor Todd Kashdan is a psychology, I'm just going to say a psychology guru. I've been interacting with Todd via email and reading his books and looking at his science for like the last 15 or 20 years. He's a professor of psychology at George Mason University and a dad to 3 daughters, which is very, very important for our conversation today. He's the author of a whole bunch of books and probably one of my favorite researchers on the planet. And Todd has recently written a book called The Art of Insubordination. This is going to be one of my top 3 books, it's absolutely going to be my top books of 2022. I read this book with nervous anticipation. I wanted it to be good, but books on this topic traditionally haven't excited me. And this, I was just blown away. I was so excited about it. So today I'm having a conversation with, like I said, one of my favorite researchers on the planet, Professor Todd Kashdan. Welcome to the Happy Families podcast, and thanks for taking time out to be with me.
To finally talk after 10 years of interacting by snail mail and passenger pigeons.
Hey, Todd, we could probably talk for hours about all of this, but because of our history and the million questions that I want to ask you, and I want everyone to know you in the way that I've come to know you over the last however long it's been, but I really think that we should stick to the book because it's going to give people a snapshot of the kind of person that you are. I'm going to say that you're a principled rebel. You're the kind of person who doesn't just follow the standard line, but there are really good reasons that you don't. But you do when you need to because it makes sense. And the book is kind of about getting this right, the art of insubordination. I read it, like I said, I totally loved it. As a population, and particularly as parents, we've got a challenging relationship with the concept of insubordination. Like, when we talk about it, we're like, yeah, I want my kids to think for themselves. I want them to be independent. I want them to not be swayed by the crowd. And yet, when they start to think for themselves, when they start to become independent, particularly in our living room or kitchen or their bedroom, as parents, we don't respond particularly well to their insubordination. Yeah,
even more than that. I mean, we want people to be independent from the crowd. At the same time, as parents, we are so concerned when our kid is not accepted by the crowd and is not spending time with those kids that are at the top of these arbitrary social hierarchies that exist everywhere. And we have to first acknowledge reality as it is, which is all of life is a middle school playground, where in terms of there are kids who are more socially attractive than others, but viewed from other kids, whether it's physical attractiveness, intelligence, wit, kindness, humor, athletic skills, just physical size and fortitude. And then there are kids at the bottom. And while we want kids to be independent, critical thinkers, we also want them to fit in. And you're at the crux of, we're immediately at a paradox of how do we accept our kid dealing with the complexity of being socially popular and independent of what the herd is going to say.
And how do we do that? That's the purpose of this conversation, right? How do we do that in relation to? I want them to be popular. I want them, not even popular. I want them to have good relationships, and yet, as soon as they're in a relationship in a school context, there's potential for things to go wrong. I kind of feel like I'm answering my own question. I feel like we've got to teach them values, right? But those values, they can get so rigid around those values that they can't make friends because of that.
Yeah, it starts with language. You're right. Popularity isn't what we're looking for. We're really we want our youth to be compelling. And so what's compelling?
Yeah.
You could break it into an equation, right? And compelling is you have likability plus competence. And to some degree, as parents and as teachers and society pretends to put the extra emphasis on the competence part. So I want you to be intellectual. I want you to be able to understand World War I and World War II. I want you to be aware of, racial dynamics from 1619 onward. I want you to be understanding of, which groups subjugated which groups in which country, and be aware of this. I want you to be athletic. I want you to be able to do 10 push-ups and 10 sit-ups. I want you to be able to run up a flight of stairs and not be winded. I want you to be able to be physically agile enough so that if you fell with a spill in aisle 5 in a grocery store, you could get back up and you wouldn't be paralyzed because you've worked out your body. That's the competence part. Society puts a lot of emphasis. But we also have the likability part, which is not necessarily being nice, kind, and compassionate all the time, but people want to be around you. And when you're around you, when people are around you, they're energized, they're charged up, the best parts of their personality come out. You put these two pieces together, it's about a compelling person. And so I think just starting there with clearly defining exactly the parameters of what we're looking for, and then we can start to build out. We can talk about kind of the strategies to get likability and the strategies to get confidence.
I love this. And if we tie it back into my previous comment about values, this is where we start to get the clash, right? Because you might have a reasonably competent child who is likable, except that they've got a particular value that's not very likable. I'm going to give you a concrete example. And I know that this one is going to clash a little bit with your values. So, this is a G-rated no swearing podcast. You like coarse language. You like to let a swear word out now and then. And I'm a non-swearer, which is so funny. I mean,
right.
You and I, we're actually very different, but we're also wonderfully aligned in so many ways. So we've taught our kids that, we don't use coarse language. We don't swear. And so what they've done is they've internalized that swearing is bad. And we've now got to try to teach them that just because somebody does swear doesn't make them a bad person. But because kids, especially when they're young, right, they're so concrete in their thinking, when the kids all start using coarse language at school and they start dropping F-bombs around the place from, let's say, grade 4, grade 5, something like that, and the kids really start to let this stuff out, our kids begin to, and we've watched this happen with all of them, they begin to move away from those kids who are using that language because, I thought you're my friend, but if you're going to use that language, you can't be my friend, and I've asked you not to because I don't like it, and you're still doing it, you're ignoring what I value, so therefore we can't be friends. And so the likability, if we go back to your competence and likability, my kids are competent.
Right.
But now that there's a values clash around this particular language issue, they've suddenly become less likable in the eyes of their friends who want to be able to swear because they feel tough and strong and mature because they're using adult language, right? And I wonder if you can just talk about what parents can do. I'm sure that not every parent is dealing with this particular issue, but they will be having those kinds of values clashes. How do you respond to that in relation to this concept of teaching your kids to be likable when that values clash is there?
I am so glad you brought up this concrete example because let's play with this because it offers an avenue to really understand what parents can do. So you captured our differences, but actually now let me explain how I parent with coarse language, which I think we're going to be completely on the same page about. So my kids, because I'm from New York City, so I came from a rough and tumble culture. So I'm very comfortable with coarse language. And my kids are taught that in the household, you can use any language you want around me. But people that are creative, now we get back to competence. People that are creative are able to use more interesting language to describe moments. So when you describe moments when they would use profanity. So when do you use profanity? When you're in pain. So we know from research that if you use profanity when you're in pain, your distress tolerance, your frustration tolerance, your ability to handle physical disruptions to your body goes up. Now, how much, who knows? Maybe it's a 10% bump. We also know it's a way of endearment. So you can, talk about your friends using profanity, and it's a way to actually show anger and indignation if someone pisses you off and you use language. So I train my kids of, listen, anybody can use the 7 dangerous words of bad language that George Carlin talked about in the 70s. But the truly creative ones are the ones that make their own language where people are allies and join you in your quest of whatever it is bothers you if someone upsets you. If you like somebody, people will be like, oh, maybe I should like them too, if you can use your own terms. So here are some terms that my kids often use. If I say something ridiculously stupid, or one of their friends do, they call me a chicken head, or their friend's a chicken head. One of my kids, when she was 8, Raven, she's now 15, she came up with a term that I still use, as opposed to using a profane word to describe your peeps. She came up with the term brochancho. No, I use this word all the time. So it is so, it undercuts any dangerous, as you were describing, adult language to look you cool. She is so creative. She comes up with her own lexicon. It's very clear in context what it is. And so there's a few things that are happening here. So one is, I'm training my kids is that creativity is something that's valued in friendship, as well as, in courtship, in, early romances or whatever it is. And it is attractive to adults in that you're showing a level of etiquette, and you're showing that you're interesting, and you're showing is that there's more to you than there's sort of an intrigue factor where I don't know everything about you. The other part of this is I'm training them to be their own individualized versions of how they're going to use language and how they're going to interact with the rest of the world other than my household. And so I'm giving them a free pass. I'm telling them, like, listen, go forth as I'm going to be your safe haven, which is basically, I know when you leave this house, you're going to grow and expand and meet new characters. I will only know them from the narratives that you tell me because I won't have firsthand experience. I welcome it. I push you in that direction. And here are some strategies that will help you along the way, but I'm not going to hold your hand. So all of that is in there, from just the idea of having a less adversarial relationship with profanity, and more of, here's just one more domain where you can be really personalize your stamp on the world.
I'm going to make sure that my daughter listens to this conversation, because and you know what else it does? On top of those, I think you mentioned 3 things, maybe it was 4, I lost count. It also makes your child more fun. Like, yeah, they're insubordinating the common language as well as the coarse or profane language by creating their own language, which makes them a more fun person, which ties in with that creative piece that you were talking about. I love it.
What made me realize that is, I've done a lot of international travel before COVID hit, and you go to other countries and they just have different terms that are basically the profane terms. And, what's profane in the UK and what's profane in Sri Lanka are foreign entities in the United States. And you realize, my God, there's so much you could do with language, and it so cheapens the extreme emotions that we feel, the high highs of like love and pleasure, and, as you're saying, fun, being around your core characters in your life, and then having adversaries and even a nemesis that's in your life. And you can't describe that with just saying I'm angry. It's a deeper emotion. You are defined by your nemesis, and your kids will have nemesis. And so to be able to be creative and describe them as like, Dante's last stage of hell is a much more creative approach. It's like, it's deep and it's dramatic and it's intellectual. It's like you said, it's interesting and it's fun. And then other people are like, okay, so if that's level 7 of Dante's Inferno, what's level 6 and 5? And all of a sudden you got yourself a much more interesting conversation, as opposed to, yeah, that kid is annoying.
And now I've got to go and read Dante to my kids. Thanks for the inspiration. Let's come back to the insubordination idea, which is at the core of your book. We've talked about values. We've talked about this competence and likability. This interview can't go ahead until I bring up one thing that you talked about in the book that completely blew my mind. I'm just going to use 2 words, and I want you to take this wherever you want, because we are talking about insubordination, and it's got to come back to kids eventually. But free throws, basketball free throws. Can you just do something with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, right now basketball is slowly working its way up to be one of the most popular sports internationally, ahead, right up there with, European soccer. And the idea of the free throw is you were fouled. And so there was basically a violation of the rules of the game. And as a result, you get to be at this line 15 feet away from a basket where you're going to throw the ball into. and everyone else is still. Your team and the other team, nobody's allowed to move. So when you even bounce the ball as you're waiting to shoot that ball 15 feet away from the basket, it is dead silence. This is a terrifying experience. Many basketball players in the professional leagues who are making millions of dollars barely get over 50% of their shots in terms at the free throw line. There's something about the trepidation of having all eyes, at least perception-wise, on you, and the entire game on a team sport. But for this moment, for this potential point, everything hinges on your shoulders. And a lot of people can't handle this pressure. So a strategy, there are two ways of throwing a free throw. One way of throwing it, which little kids 3, 4, 5, 6 years of age will do, which they take the ball and they rock it between their legs and they throw it underhand to get to the basket.
I'd call that that'd be a granny shot. That's how I'd call that.
The granny shot, yeah. So this is, if you watch kids first pick up a basketball and you point to a hoop that's higher than them and say, get that ball in there, they don't do it overhand. They take the ball and they're in their two hands and they rock it back and forth and throw it as high as they can. And there's a reason that they do this. The kids pick this up naturally. It's because it is the most fluid, efficient motion, physics-wise, anatomically wise, to project the ball upward into the air. The other way of throwing a ball is what you would see if you watch high school basketball games, college basketball games, or professional basketball games, which is this very complicated set of maneuvers where one hand, both of your arms are bent at the elbow around your chest level. One of your hands is holding the ball, and that hand is going to project the ball forward towards the basket, while the other hand slightly holds the edge of the ball as a stabilizer. And both of those hands are going to push forward, but only one hand is going to push that ball at hopefully around a 40-degree angle to get to the basketball hoop.
With just enough backspin, you've got to put backspin on it, don't you?
Yeah, you want it, if you could, you would preferably with your hand have a little bit of a shift in your hand, so it's going to turn backwards when it hits the rim, and so it'll slow its speed, bounce off the rim or the backboard, and have multiple possibilities to get into the hoop if you don't get a swish or it perfectly goes through the hoop. Now, the interesting thing about the free throws is everybody does it the hard way. Two hands, one stabilizer, one arm is propulsion, one arm is stabilizing. Everybody uses this. Right now, there is 2 basketball players in all colleges around the United States and all professional leagues. There are 2 players that will throw it underhand. So it's not even 99.99%. It just goes, those nines just go forever. It's basically 2 human beings are willing to throw underhand. And the reason is because, and this is what's so amazing, these athletes are being paid astronomical amounts of money for one reason only: win games so we can win money as our franchise. But the fear of looking foolish, the embarrassment of being to act like a little kid and slowly rock the ball between your legs has become so normative as something that's scornful, resentful, embarrassing, humiliating, and, for lack of a better word, non-masculine, that nobody's willing to do this. And professional players will say this in interviews repeatedly, which says, I would rather stop playing basketball than throw the ball underhand as a granny shot. And if grown adults who are some of the most physically fit specimens of humans on the earth, who are paid millions, are unwilling to throw the better way that's more accurate and more reliable, that will make them more money and have their team win more games, they're unwilling to do this because they're embarrassed of deviating from the norm. What does that say about society in terms of being able to think for yourself and question and be skeptical about popular sentiments in the culture?
Or to go your own way. Can you just, I can't remember exactly the stat, but you mentioned in the book a a basketball player who does or did, I think he's retired now, he did play with an underhand free throw. And
Rick Barry.
Yeah, that's right. And what was his percentage of hits?
94% of his shots would go in over the course of his career.
And you're saying that the majority don't even hit 50%?
Well, I was probably being a little bit, unfortunately, hyperbolic. So it's around the average percent at the professional level is around 76%, and the average percentage of getting in a free throw at the college level is under 70%.
Okay, so we're talking about a 20 to 25% improvement by doing something that is insubordinate.
Right, and just for those people listening that aren't basketball fans, most games are won by less than 10 points. So you're talking about giving away potentially 20 points per game if one team kept throwing overhand and one team threw granny shots. That's a 20-point differential, all else being equal.
Okay, so that's the stats are phenomenal. It's an incredible story. And it's a long way, but I think the story is worth it. But it's a long way to get to this point, and that is, how do we teach our kids to not be afraid to throw underhand, metaphorically speaking?
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you took it to this place. Essentially, is we want to be training everyone. I mean, kids are just, they're not small adults, because it's not like the job of kids is to become big adults. The job of kids is just to live a good life and learn and grow just like adults. We want to be teaching about functionality. I mean, we want to be teaching about to live by your principles, and losing while you stick to your principles is better than winning by taking the shortcuts. I mean, that's what this is about. When you're choosing a dysfunctional social norm, that's we know statistically, we know by science, we know just by proof of concept of watching people do it, that something is easier, and the harder way is acceptable because it looks cool. We're moving away from function. We're moving away from principles. We are allowing social acceptability to override every metric that's important to the domain that you're focusing on. So you take it into reading. There are some books that are going to be more popular and look cooler in the presence of other kids. And other books will be, deemed as inferior or, undesirable. I mean, just think of this for an example. There are so many books that are deemed under, these books are what girls read and these books are what guys read.
Great example. Yep.
So if you think about high school, just think about Jane Eyre. The idea of a guy reading Jane Eyre as they're sitting on a grassy knoll on a college campus, your first inference is, one, are they in mating mode and they're trying to attract other people, in terms of because one strategy to attract a mate is to show that you are open-minded to reading books that are atypical for a man to read, and for a woman to read a book that's contrary to the norm of what a woman should read. So just to keep it stereotypical, a woman reading a book about, mechanical engineering, a guy reading a book on, written by Jane Eyre, you're talking about stereotyped non-conforming behavior. People are skeptical about whether they actually like what they're reading, or they're trying to, present themselves as someone that's non-conformist. I would say is that when we see people that act in counter stereotypical ways, how we frame those moments is going to create an image for our children of how they can behave and deviate from social norms. So every time that you see someone that dresses in an unusual way and it looks like they're enjoying themselves, dancing by themselves with their headphones on the street while everybody looks at them funny, what you should be doing in those moments, and laugh, enjoy the moment. I mean, these are unusual moments. You see somebody on a unicycle and they're dancing and they're singing, ABBA songs from the 1970s while going down the street. It's an unusual scenario. I would point to my kids and say, listen, that guy that's what courage looks like. It's this authentic stamp of how he's living his life, And there's something really beautiful about completely relentless desires and passions that you're willing to pursue despite the public stares.
Todd, I reckon we could talk for days about this. You've got an entire chapter about encouraging principled rebellion in kids in the book, The Art of Insubordination. And I loved reading that chapter. I thought that the way you brought the science into it, but also made it so accessible. It was just really worth investigating. Before we wrap up, there's a question that's been on my mind quite a lot in the last couple of years. In Australia, we've had a lot of in fact, globally, there's been a lot of really big conversations about masculinity. And I'm thinking about insubordination in relation to raising boys who are willing to question the dominant masculine narrative that exists and that is unfortunately in some places toxic, to use the term, because there is this idea out there, right? Boys are supposed to be big and strong. They're supposed to keep their emotions in check. They're supposed to be on this sexual conquest all the time. They're allowed to They're allowed to be angry, but not much else. There is this sort of, I've got a book on my shelf right behind me here by a Harvard researcher called Bill Pollack called Real Boys, and he talks about all the different ways that this masculinity narrative plays out. How would we teach our kids to become insubordinate in the face of what is really a society-wide expectation and still manage to hold their head high, right? I mean, there's so much pressure to conform to the norm.
Yeah, I mean, you just asked a hour and a half conversation question.
Yeah, yeah. In 90 seconds or less, please.
I mean, so my immediate response when people talk about toxic masculinity is twofold. One is something you said, which I think is important, is we have outdated scripts about how boys are supposed to behave and how girls are supposed to behave. I mean, there's no question about that. And I think you captured it very nicely, so there's no reason for me to repeat it. The second one is we have to allow variety and individual differences in people's behavior. So any time that we're talking about an entire species, all boys, all men, all girls, all women, under one monolithic entity, we're whatever we say about for describing that, we're immediately moving into problems. I mean, there's a reason that boys tend to act in a particular way that on average is different than girls. You could think about it from a list of evolutionary motives that guide behavior. So let me just kind of humor you with a few of them. Avoid toxins. So that could be, particular foods, particular animals, anything that's going to kind of give it a sense of disease. Avoid enemies. So you're going to know there are people that are predictable characters that are going to be dangerous and likely to violate you and be physically dangerous to be around. Make friends, find romantic partners, maintain relationships with romantic partners, develop a strong sense of identity so that you're not pulled by the whimsical ideas and preferences of other people. Have a focus on generativity where you're considering not just yourself, but pro-socially thinking about other people. And developing a sense of physical care for you. So in terms of your physical health, you're being agile, strong, sense of endurance that happens there. So you have a mating mindset, you have a physical health mindset, you have a friend finding mindset, you have a avoid disease and toxins mindset. We behave differently depending on which one of those modes is activated by the situation. So some of the things that we regard as problematic as masculinity are actually perfectly appropriate for the task at hand. So if you're talking about dealing with danger, toxins, disease, and enemies, in this case, it is perfectly okay to assert yourself and show the dominant side of your personality and even be cantankerous in situations. Now, if in terms of finding friends, maintaining friendships, finding mates, maintaining mates, in this situation is where we've outdated scripts. Like you said, hunters and hunted. And the idea is we want boys to realize is that the way that you're going to be socially attracted to other people is not going to be hunting people and treating them as a means to an end, but as an end to themselves. And so the idea of keeping your head high is to realize that you do not have this stable set of personality characteristics. You have a particular personality that is activated by situations. So the way to actually work with boys is not to kind of undo hundreds of years of society, but to think of in which area are you seeing behavior that's not workable at getting the goals that they want. So it's easy to tweak about, hey, listen, you're really funny, you're extremely witty in terms of talking to other people, but you're horrible at listening and you ask very few questions. Add this to your repertoire, you're going to make more friends, and you're going to find that whatever mates you're looking for, people are going to be more attracted towards you. So now we've modified specific behaviors as opposed to saying we're trying to remove elements of masculinity. And I think that's going to be a more useful strategy than thinking about trying to change masculinity, which is so overwhelming that there's almost nothing you can do with that.
What I love about that as well is it's number one, it's direct, which works really well for guys, right? I mean, sometimes we need to be hit right between the eyes with good advice, and that what you just said there is so direct. And secondly, it's so specific, it's so concrete. It's like, okay, yeah, I can do that. As opposed to, as you said, this nebulous, enormous, impossible change that I'm supposed to change the very nature of myself and the way society sees me so that I can conform to a new norm. And I mean, we are moving in an increasingly positive direction in some segments of our society, but there's so much room to move. And I get the sense that if we can give that personalized help to our boys in particular, it could make a difference. Todd, I reckon this has been just so helpful for so many parents. Really wish we could keep on going, but I need to honour your time. You've been more than generous already, and we have gone over time. Thanks for joining me in this conversation today.
Yeah, you ask amazing questions, so I am happy to have 3-hour conversations anytime, anyway. And I am glad that there are resources now where more information is coming as parents, because all of us want the manual and none of us got the manual.
Yeah, well, one of those resources, I reckon, should be Todd Kashdan's book, The Art of Insubordination. It's got a whole lot more in the subtitle, but that's all you need to Google. Todd Kashdan, Art of Insubordination, great book, and a wonderful chapter on parenting right at the end. But it's just a fascinating book generally. The Happy Families podcast, as always, is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer, and if you'd like more info about making your family happier, you can visit happyfamilies.com.au.